This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you by my new full chainmail print t-shirts and pants, as well as full print hoodies and new Shadiversity t-shirts, which are tunic chainmail-like hybrid prints. They're awesome. Perfect for LARP or just showing your medieval enthusiasm to the world. You can wear the long sleeve one under a shirt or the short sleeve one just out there because it's awesome. It is a high detailed, historically accurate, riveted mail print made from real chainmail itself, and it's awesome. So if you're interested in grabbing yourself a set, there is a link in the description below.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I have addressed the katana in many videos on my channel, trying to dismiss the misconceptions, but also establish what are its strengths versus its weaknesses. And the katana generally comes up casually in many different video topics, and then I have my full large katana series. But I've realized I don't have a single video that addresses all the misconceptions in one concise way, which is what I'm doing in this video right now. And if you want the deep dive, well, I do have a 5-part katana series which goes into academic studies on the katana, metallurgical analysis and all that stuff, which is the proof. It establishes all the things that I'm going to be sharing here right now, and I'll be trying to explain these points that I'm going through as best I can, as concisely as I can, because you know me, I never go off on random tangents. But anyway, I do the best I can, and hopefully make this video as a kind of a point of reference that can be used to point towards this is the truth about the katana. So let me say right off the bat that the katana is one of my favorite swords, okay? I love this thing, but the thing is, I want things to be understood in their correct context. And so even though I love the katana, I hate that people misunderstand it. And they also put the katana on a pedestal to make it seem like it's better than every sword in the world. It's not, okay? The katana is not a magical sword that is the best sword in the world. It is great at what it's meant to do. So when put in the correct context of what the katana is made for, what it excels at, it's great at that. It doesn't mean it is the best at that. What I'm cutting. The katana is a beastie cutter. Is it the best cutter in the world? Well, I mean, it depends. What makes good cutting, okay? If you made a sword that was ridiculously top-heavy, that you just needed to drop it and it would cut through anything, well, yeah, you could say it's the best cutter in the world, but it would be unwieldy and you wouldn't be able to use it, okay? A sword needs to hit a specific balance to be a really good sword. The katana does hit a decent balance, but there are other swords that can cut better than it, okay? There are other swords that are better, well, there are other swords that exceed at certain other things that just the katana doesn't, excel at. Like, it can thrust, but it's not the best thruster in the world, okay? In terms of how nimble it is and how easy you can redirect the blade, there are other swords that are far more nimble than it, okay? So the first thing out of that, we need to understand and address the katana is not a magical sword and it's not the best sword in the world. It is a great sword at cutting and what it's meant to do. It's pretty rubbish against armor, okay? And in a one-on-one duel, if you're fighting someone with another sword, it has a lack of hand protection, everything like that. But that's the first misconception out of the gate, is that it's not magical, it's not the best sword in the world. These next points I'm going to elaborate on further, but I'm just going to say quickly is that the steel is not the best steel in the world, okay? The katana is not the sharpest sword in the world. It is not the strongest sword in the world. It is not the lightest sword in the world. It is not the most shock-absorbent sword in the world. And this slight curve does not increase cutting capacity. All these things that I just mentioned are things that I've heard academics try and claim about the katana, and that it is better in these qualities than any other sword. All of those things are incorrect, and I'm going to explain why. I'll start with the metal, and this is one of the most misunderstood things about the katana, and it is usually the cause or reason that people give as to why it is stronger, sharper, lighter, and all these things. And it all comes back to that it was folded 2,000 times, and because that's made it so incredibly strong. And people who say that if you fold steel 2,000 times, it inherently makes it better, stronger, sharper, all these things, honestly have no idea about blacksmithing or metallurgy. And I used to say that it was the folding, like when I was a teenager, I was fooled by these documentaries and even pop culture that it's because it's the folding that does it. No. Okay. Folding steel is only necessary if the steel you are starting with has impurities in it. If the steel you are starting with has the right carbon content, it's the right grade of steel, and it doesn't have impurities, folding that steel will make it worse, okay? When you forge something, you inherently lose carbon content to the oxygen around it. All the smacking, all the heating, all the scale. The scale is the steel oxidizing, oxygen bonding with it, okay, flaking off. And when you fold it, not only do you have a chance of trapping scale in the folds, you are decarburizing the steel. And the more folds you do into steel that has already got the right carbon content, the more carbon you will lose, which means you could render it down back into iron, all right? So folding steel does not inherently make it better. What it does do, it can remove impurities. How does folding steel remove impurities? Well, this is one. If you have non-metallic inclusions in this steel, they have a lower melting temperature than the steel itself. So when you heat up this kind of block of steel to the point where it isn't liquefied, the steel isn't liquefied, but it's red hot, well, the non-metallic inclusions have liquefied. And when you hammer them down, fold it around and hammer it down, you can squeeze those little pockets of liquid non-metallic inclusions out of the steel. And the more you do it, the more you fold it, the more you squeeze it out to the point where you can actually pop them out of the steel itself. It does not remove all the impurities. In fact, folding steel like this, it is impossible to remove all those impurities. You can get rid of the larger pockets of impurities and a decent amount. So it does help purify the steel. And then the next thing, the impurities that you can't get rid of, because it's impossible to remove all those impurities in this method, you homogenize those impurities uniformly throughout the steel. So that means when you hammer it out into a long blade now, it means there's no one large pocket of impurities that would cause a fatal point where the blade will break. It's all uniform, which means you can be very assured that the strength of the sword at this point is as strong as the sword at this point. Next thing, the folding method on the katana wasn't folded 2,000 times. You can reach up to 2,000 layers, but you only need like 20 folds to get there. Think about it. One fold, you got 2 layers. 2 folds, you have 4 layers. 3 folds, you have 8 layers. 4 folds, you have 16, 32, 64. It goes up, okay? So you can reach the glorious 2,000 layers, but not 2,000 folds, okay? If you folded steel 2,000 times, you would probably render it down into iron and ruin it. So then, why do they fold it? Well, it's because, like I said, the steel they start with has a lot of impurities in it. And the method, okay, the actual folding method is an ingenious method to be able to take this lower quality steel, and it is lower quality, okay? Now, people say, Tamahagane, the steel that the katana is made out of, is glorious. No, it's just high carbon, okay? And especially with earlier technology, it could be difficult to make higher carbon steel when you didn't understand the processes perfectly, okay? But the tatara, the big, smelting thing that makes Tamahagane, the tatara, is in its most basic state, a large bloomery furnace. And bloomery steel has been known in many cultures for thousands of years, before the medieval period even, okay? Bloomery steel, it's how they started smelting iron in the classical period, even with the Romans, okay? Bloomery forges has been known for ages. The difference between the tatara and other bloomery furnaces is that it's big. It's a big bloomery furnace, but that is it. And the other thing that kind of proves what I'm talking about, okay, is the metal, the big metal slab chunk thing that you get out of a tatara, that's not all Tamahagane. They actually have to look at it, break off chunks of the steel that has the right carbon content. Why? Because just with any other bloomery, this is the whole thing about bloomery furnaces, it doesn't fully liquefy the iron. And if the iron isn't fully liquefying, that means that the carbon content can't diffuse evenly through the iron to get perfectly uniform high quality steel as a result. The steel that you're going to get out of it is going to have a lot of non-metallic inclusions, and the carbon content is not going to be diffused uniformly. And so what they do when they have this big chunk of metal from the tatara, they break it apart and they look for the bits of steel that are shinier, a bit more silvery, because the more silvery it is, the more carbon content it has. And then they actually look for what is good Tamahagane, which is steel that has the right carbon content, break it off into chunks and keep them together. This is why Tamahagane is always in little chunks, and they need to be flattened out and put into this kind of thing to be forge welded together, okay? If it was if the tatara made good quality steel, they wouldn't need to do that. It would already, you would get a puck out of it of good quality, uniform, with no non-metallic inclusion, so pure steel of the right carbon content straight away. You wouldn't need to fold it then to get rid of the impurities, and then you could just bash it out into the length that you want. There are many types of steel that is actually better than Tamahagane, the steel that makes the katana traditionally, because it's better technology. Crucible steel, okay? If you put steel into kind of a clay crucible, put it in a forge fire thing of the right temperature so much that you can actually liquefy the iron, you will diffuse the carbon in it uniformly, and you would get a higher quality steel as a result of the right carbon content out of the gate. If you put this crucible in a furnace that can get hot enough to the point where it will fully liquefy the iron, the impurities will naturally float to the surface, okay? These are bits of like glass, silicon, and all the other things, but generally all these bits of rock, dirt, and everything, they melt and they rise to the surface, they float on top, and then the carbon gets fully diffused evenly throughout it. When the result is a puck, it gets diffused evenly in the puck, and you get much better quality pure steel as a result. And guess what? This is technology that did exist in the medieval period, okay? Not everywhere in the medieval period, because this is the thing people need to understand, both in medieval, Europe and medieval era Japan, is that there was good quality and bad quality, but everyone always grabs the best quality katanas. Do you know how many crap quality katanas there were that just would bend easily, couldn't hold an edge, that didn't have the right carbon content and were closer to iron than steel? There were a lot more than people realize, okay? Sword quality historically was always on a spectrum, and the best quality smiths, okay, the best smiths would be able to make the best quality ones and they'd get paid more, but there are a lot of crappy ones out there, okay? And people tend to like to compare the, best quality katana with the worst quality European swords. But no, all right? If you want to compare best to best, you can compare the best quality katana against the best quality European swords. And when you do that, you're looking at swords that were made out of crucible steel that actually are made out of better steel. Having said that though, the differences in quality are very small, in all honesty, in terms of the actual strength and durability. What has a far greater impact on the strength and durability of a sword is not necessarily the steel, as long as the steel is decent, okay? And the steel that you get, the resulting steel that you get out of the folding process on a katana is decent. And same with, even crucible steels. Like the differences between good crucible steel and the steel that you get in the katana, they're both pretty good. And I would say crucible steel is naturally better because it has less impurities and it's more uniform and all those things. But the differences between crucible steel and katana, traditional folded steel, are so small, in regular use, you would barely notice it. Okay, you'll barely notice those strength differences if you're comparing best to best, okay? So even though I think the crucible steel is better, you wouldn't really notice the difference. The thing that causes a much larger difference in its handling and mechanical properties is the quenching stage, okay? The quenching and tempering stage. Now, the quenching and tempering stage is very important because that actually gives the katana not only its iconic curve, but also its iconic hammer line, which is the wavy pattern you see on katanas, okay? The katanas traditionally, when they're traditionally made, are done through differential hardening, where they will make the edge harder than the back. This is in contrast to most European methods of forging swords in the quenching and tempering stage, where they have a mono hardness. It's not differential, it's all the same, uniform throughout. Which is better? Well, there's pros and cons to both, but one has a massive advantage over the other, which I'm going to get to. But before I do that, I want to address some of the other misconceptions next coming up, which is that the katana is the sharpest sword in the world. And this is related into the quenching and tempering because the katana is quenched in such a way where the edge is a lot harder. They put a thin layer of clay on the edge, thicker on the back, and so the edge hardens quicker than the back, which makes the edge, the crystalline structure, the metallurgical crystalline structure of the edge, martensite. Then they have a pearlite, which is another crystalline structure, which is not as hard as martensite, a pearlite kind of jacket with a nearly ferrite or iron core. The ferrite can sometimes have lines of cementite, and so it's a lower quality of pearlite steel, but most traditionally made katanas have 3 types of crystalline structure. Now, as a result, you have a very hard edge. Steels that are harder, okay, can hold their edges for longer. That doesn't mean they're inherently sharper. They just remain sharper for longer. You can sharpen up crappy iron to be as sharp as a katana. It'll just lose the edge quicker. That's the difference. Now to the misconceptions of the katana's strength and shock absorbency, because this is directly impacted by the differential hardening that I was mentioning before. People assume that because the back edge of the katana is not as hard as the actual edge, that somehow makes it shock absorbent and therefore resistant to chipping and dinting and breaking. That's completely incorrect. In actual fact, because that the edge is so hard, it's actually more prone to cracks. Okay, the harder something gets, the more prone it'll be to crack instead of just deform and dint. Okay, so that's the first misconception to break off. And then people assume that it'll be resistant to bending, which is also completely incorrect. What differential hardening will do, and I'll come closer to the camera, is is if you have a harder edge and a softer back, is that when you get a crack or something that impacts them, because remember, the edge is much harder on a katana than the other parts of the sword. When a crack happens and it reaches the part of the blade that's softer, and there's a really soft internal core on most katanas, which is closer to ferrite, and then this outer kind of side jacket here is a pearlite type of steel. And so the crack will go in and it will stop. All right, if this whole blade was as hard as the edge, that crack will go through and snap. And so what it generally does, I'm not saying katanas can't snap in two, they absolutely can, but generally, by having differential hardening, katanas will tend to bend instead of snapping in two. That's the answer. The problem is, they don't flex, okay? They are not springs. And to get a spring, the whole sword needs to be about as hard as what the katana's edge usually is, martensite, but then it needs to be tempered, which relieves some of the stress and gives the sword springiness. Now that type of steel is what you'll find in the best quality medieval European swords. Springiness. See the springiness of my sword, and it's a far more springy up at the tip, okay? It's made to do that because this is a practice one, all right? That is purely possible because of the type of steel that this sword is made out of. It is martensite that has been properly tempered to give it the springy quality. Now, if I did this, if I flexed the katana as much as I'm flexing this sword, it would stay that way. It would bend and stay bent. This is the truth about the katana, okay, is that they are not as durable as other swords, but they are generally far more resistant. So here, see how easy it is to flex this sword this much? To flex the katana to that same level, I would need to apply far more force. So it is more resistant to flexing, it's more stiff. The reason why it's more stiff is because it's thicker. Do you see the thickness difference in these swords? I'll try and kind of turn them on the thing. If you can't see it, the katana at the tip is 3, almost 4 mil thick at the tip, compared to this, which is about 1.5 to 2 mil thick at the tip, okay? So resistant to flexing, capable of flexing. The problem is when the katana does eventually flex, even though it takes more force to flex, when it does, it's gonna stay bent. Katanas bend, they don't flex back, unless they're made out of modern steel. A lot of modern katana reproductions aren't made in the traditional way. They're made in this way, with spring steel, because spring steel is ultimately more durable. So almost by necessity, katanas need to be thicker to resist any bending, because when they bend, that's where you run into troubles. So to make it a balanced, functional sword, a couple of things need to be done. The blade needs to be a bit shorter, because if you're going to have a blade so thick at the tip, if you have it as long as a long sword, it's going to be way too top heavy. So do you see the length differences here between the katana and long sword? Quite different in length. Too top heavy if you made as long. Now, having said that, there are katanas that are about as long as a long sword, and they are beastie choppers. So they're not completely unfunctional. I think generally they will have a bit of a, thinner tip, but they won't be nearly as nimble as longsword, and it's an interesting trade-off, because this longsword, if it was sharp, would have nowhere near as much bite if you cut with the tip as you can with a katana. See, this is one of the advantages that the katana gets. Remember, it's always a bit of a trade-off. With a katana being thick at the top like this, its chops are devastating even when you strike at the top end. And so even though the katana is shorter than the longsword, okay, to get a good effective, really good chop with this longsword, you would need to strike someone about right here on the blade. But with the katana, you can actually get a good chop right at the tip, and you don't always need to aim further down the blade. And so in that sense, the katana still has decently good chopping range. But where the longsword really excels at, it's of course in thrusting, okay? And having said that, if you try and chop someone and you're just out of range, but with the longsword, because it's longer, it's just in range, well, you could still like slice someone's throat open. So even though the longsword isn't as good with chopping at the tip, it can still chop, right? So it's always a decent trade-off between the two. And remember, the katana isn't a horrible sword, like I said at the beginning. I'm just trying to dispel the misconceptions, but one of its great strengths is its cutting capacity, and it does get that because It's thick, okay, and rigid and resistant to vibration because of that. One of the weaknesses longswords and any swords that have, thinner blades on them is that they're much more prone to vibration. And if you hit something with wrong edge alignment, they can vibrate and bounce off, whereas the katana is particularly resistant to that because it's thicker. So now I've addressed the overall strength of the katana and the myth that it's shock absorbent because of the differential hardening. No, it's shock absorbent because it's thick, right? But yeah, it's not going to flex back. So now let's address one of the other myths, is that the curve assists with cutting ratio, and the answer is it doesn't. It's barely got a curve, okay? Not like it's barely off straight. Now, you can get advantages in the cutting ratio if a sword is more prominently curved, like, say Tolwas, the whole scimitar kind of family of swords, Tolwa, Shamshir, those ones, right? And very prominently curved, okay, then you can, of course, do wide draw cuts, but the type of draw cut you can do with a katana, you can do with a longsword. You can strike and draw in when you're striking, and you can also do push cuts just as easily. And remember, the katana barely has a curve. It's barely off straight. And so the drawing motion that you can get between a straight sword and a katana doesn't change much at all. I tested this with a 3D model in my katana series, and the additional cutting ratio is pittance. So much so, it's not even worth mentioning. The whole reason why the katana has a curve is actually due to the differential hardening process, okay? Because the back is thicker than the edge, there's more steel that wants to contract when you quench the actual blade, and so that pulls the blade back. First it curves forward because this cools down faster, because the back cools down slower, it then pulls it back, and then the katana gets its natural curve. So it's purely from the differential hardening, but the thing is, you could still make a straight katana with differential hardening if you started with an inverse curve. This is actually proven in one of Alex Steele's videos, where he was trying to make a rapier, and he was trying to make it straight, and it was always curving to the side because he, I forget what he did with that one specifically. I think he did a different pattern on one side. He wanted like a hamon line or something like that. And so to get the rapier to remain straight, he needed to make an inverse curve, quench it, and let the cooling down pull it back into straight.
And you can see, look at that. That is some serious bend. And then up at the tip, like that's crazy, crazy bend. Completely unacceptable. It's still bending. I think that gap is still increasing as it's cooling. Unbelievable, right? Righty-ho, we put a bend opposite to the way that it warped itself as it did its final part of the cooling. It's still just as curved. I wonder if this time, however, it will straighten. Fingers crossed. All right, let's have a look at this thing. But that is straightened. No way! What? What the? This is freaking magic!
So it can be done, all right? And so people who made the katana could have made it without the curve. If they wanted to, it would be a lot more work. So, and because the curve, I mean, it looks good, and it does have an advantage. It certainly doesn't harm its cutting ratio. So there's no real point in going to all the work to make it straight. And there is an advantage, and it's that the curve makes it kind of auto-correcting in its edge alignment, and it's simply proven by this. If I hold the katana like this and let it roll, watch how it rolls. See that? It'll roll into straight. And so if you strike something with a katana and your edge alignment is off, it naturally, when it hits, because of the curve, wants to pull itself into correct edge alignment and then go through. And then because it's also resistant to vibration, that enhances the effect even more so. And so the katana is actually easier to cut with than other swords. Does that make it better at cutting? No, in some instances, okay. It doesn't mean it has the capacity to cut through things that other swords can't, that doesn't have these properties, because all you need to do is strike with good edge alignment and it'll go through. It means the katana is easier at cutting, and therefore it's easy to make good cuts with, but it doesn't mean that it can always cut through things that other swords that are good at cutting but have more flex and aren't curved are incapable of doing. Those swords would still be able to cut through the same thing. You just got to be good at it, okay? Get good edge alignment, and then you'd be able to do it. So the katana, in that sense, is easier to cut with, and it's one of its advantages, okay? It's a legitimately cool, mechanical kind of advantage to its design. Katana is still a good sword, okay? I'm just trying to debunk the bull trap and also give it credit where it deserves it. Because there are some other things that make the katana good at what it does, and I want to address those right now because I've addressed all the misconceptions, okay? It is not sharper, it is not stronger, it doesn't mean that it's weaker, it's about the same with certain strengths and weaknesses, though it doesn't flex, that's a problem. It's not lighter, it's not made out of better steel on average than other swords, and the curve doesn't assist in its cutting ratio. But it is still good at cutting, and I've already addressed some of the reasons why. It's stiff, it's forgiving in the cut, it has kind of an auto-correcting thing on on the edge alignment, it rolls right into it. And the other thing is the fact that it has a single edge. Now, why does making it a single edge make it good? It's not inherently because it's got a single edge, it's that it's taking advantage of one of the things you can take advantage of with a single edge, and that is the length of the edge bevel. What do I mean? I specifically mean the length that you have between the very end of the edge and the end of the bevel itself. So you see this from tip right to about there. That's the actual length of the edge bevel. Now compare that to double-bladed swords, okay? Because you need two edge bevels on the sword, the length of these edge bevels are much shorter than the katana. And so the katana, with having a longer edge bevel, that means it can have a smaller edge itself, like a more narrow, finer edge. What do I mean? A sword that has an edge bevel like that is going to cut far worse than one that has something like that. This is a natural advantage that any single edge sword can take advantage of because it doesn't need to, you know, shorten the edge bevel to fit another edge on the back end. So you can make the edge bevel go all the way in, okay? Make it longer. And every sword does have a secondary bevel. So when you're looking at a blade, okay, this is the edge bevel, all right? Now, a secondary edge bevel is the final kind of point where it comes in to the blade. So you've got the normal edge bevel, and then right at the tip, it kind of curves off a bit more steeper right to the end of the sword. Every sword is going to have that no matter how narrow it can, but by the design and nature of the katana, secondary edge bevel is far more shallow than what you'd have to do on a sword that has a shorter edge bevel. And so again, because it has a very small secondary bevel, the angle of the edge can be far finer, okay? Doesn't mean it can be sharper, but it can get that advantage and still be very robust. With, say, again, longsword comparison, or any sword that is double-bladed, okay? If you want an edge bevel to be very narrow, guess what it needs to be because the edge bevel isn't as long? It needs to be thinner. It needs to be thinner along that way because the more narrow you make that edge, okay, this is the middle of the sword we're looking at, the more narrow you make it, the thinner the sword needs to be. And the thinner the sword, the more flex it'll have, and that means if your edge alignment is off, you can bounce right off the target. But with a single-edged sword, well, you can get away with having that narrow edge because this bevel is longer and you can still have a thick blade as a result, which makes it very resistant to vibration and bouncing off targets. And so there we go. These have been the main misconceptions of the katana. And, you know, I think we covered them all. If I missed any, do share them in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. I hope you have enjoyed, and of course, I hope to see you in the next video. So until that time, farewell.